besides the Green Party of Brooklyn, Brooklyn for Peace, and the Park Slope Methodist Church put this together, but there are many, many sponsors who signed on to this really important forum tonight. We're going to talk about a big secret and hope that by the end of this evening there's not such a secret anymore and that we're going to be able to do something about that. I will say in terms of the TPP that if we wanted to address all the issues that it covers and that we should be concerned about, we would have no room on this panel. But we are fortunate to have at least 3 people who can talk about different aspects of it and a little bit of an overview to get things started, because we're really talking about something that affects health, affects food, affects the environment, finance, labor, many, many, many things. And so if you had any worries or any doubts before that our lives are not our own, that we're not being controlled by the corporate man behind the curtain, you will really find out today that that unfortunately is true. And so we should be afraid, but when we finish tonight, we should be resolved to take this forward and do more. And we'll talk about those action items. So I'm going to let you know who our speakers are. Our first speaker will be Adam Weissman from Global Justice for Animals and the Environment and Trade Justice New York Metro. He'll be followed by Jennifer Flynn, Managing Director of Health Gap, which is an international AIDS activist organization. And our last speaker will be Gary Goff from the Climate Action Environmental Committee of Brooklyn for Peace, and a longtime labor activist.
There has been a very concerted effort to make sure that as few people as possible have heard of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is an effort that involves the active collaboration of our president, who has run TPP with an unprecedented level of secrecy, far exceeding anything seen under the Bush administration, of the corporate media. 3 of the biggest media corporations, Time Warner, Viacom, and News Corp, the people who own Fox News and the New York Post, are members of the corporate lobbying coalition on behalf of TPP, which really gives the full lie to Fox's fair and balanced slogan, how can you be lobbying on an issue and expected to report on it fairly at the same time? So we are not supposed to know about TPP, and there's a very clear reason why we are not supposed to know about TPP. Ron Kirk, the former U.S. trade representative, said that this is a paraphrase, but it's essentially almost what he said that it is very important that the negotiations not be conducted in public, because when trade negotiations have released their negotiating texts in the past, it has created problems that have made it impossible to complete the negotiations. And what he's talking about are cases like the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which was conducted with far greater transparency in the early 2000s and fell apart because there was massive resistance to this hemispheric trade agreement throughout the Americas. In Mexico, there was a popular referendum. In Brazil, there was a level of resistance that went all the way up to the government. The government ended up in power. In the United States and Canada, there were massive demonstrations in Miami and Quebec City, and FTA fell apart. Similarly, the multilateral agreement on investments, with intense pushback from the 99%, fell apart. The World Trade Organization came to a grinding halt at the Battle of Seattle when a broad cross-section of social movements united in the streets to say no to corporate rule, and in the process empowered negotiators from Global South nations to say no to first world hegemony and corporate rule at the expense of the world's poorest people. So they've learned their lesson. And Ron Kirk went on to say, as if the point wasn't clear enough, that the biggest opposition to TPP is not the complexity of negotiating between 12 different governments, is not the different conflicting interests of governments, but is domestic opposition right here in the United States. It's people saying, what are you doing? You're giving everything away. That is a direct quote. So our government is very conscious that if the 99% found out what is being done by our government in our name, we would never accept it. Thus, it is our job to make sure that TPP does not remain a secret and that as many people know about this terrible trade agreement as possible before it is too late. And so that's what we're doing here tonight, and that is hopefully what each one of you will do after tonight, spreading the word to everyone you know so that we can drag TPP to a grinding halt, as we have done before with other corporate power grabs. So what is TPP? TPP, it should be understood, it's called a partnership, it's called a trade agreement. Only 5 chapters of TPP's over 24 chapters actually deal with trade. And until Japan was added into this trade agreement, the actual trade impacts of this 12-country deal, which includes the United States, Mexico, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam. Oh gosh, I know them all, I just don't know if I said them all yet because I don't remember which ones I said. There's 12 of them, Japan. Yeah, before Japan was added into this trade agreement, the countries in this trade agreement fell into one of 2 categories. Countries with tiny economies, or countries that we already had trade agreements with. So TPP was not really ever, well, before Japan was in it at least, about expanding trade. So what is TPP really about? TPP and agreements like it are really about pushing the 1%'s agenda for what they've really always wanted. For what they wanted when they passed NAFTA, for what they wanted when they enacted the WTO, for what they wanted in the early 20th century when the ruling elites of this country got together and tried to stage a coup against our government unsuccessfully. They went to the wrong guy, Smedley Butler, who was at the time the most decorated military man in history, and wasn't necessarily willing to overthrow the government on behalf of the 1%. Okay, pick up the mic, thank you. This is nothing new. It's the latest permutation of the corporations and the 1% trying to rule everything, trying to circumvent democracy, trying to eliminate our power as voters, as citizens, trying to roll back all the gains that we have won over decades of social movement campaigning, and create a system of global corporate governments that supersedes our national laws, that supersedes our ability to hold corporations accountable, and that puts corporations in charge so that they can maximize their profits at the expense of the public interest and minimize our ability to do anything about it. So our speakers tonight are going to give you details on some of the different areas that are going to be affected as a result, and I'm going to begin by talking about how TPP is going to impact our environment, the safety of our food, the welfare of animals, and the human rights of people on the front lines of environmental defense struggles. So I'm going to talk about 10 different areas in which TPP is really a danger to those concerns. And I'm just going to list them off. The first is government procurement, and this is one of the clear areas where TPP attacks democracy. One of the things that we're able to do as taxpayers, as citizens, as people who have a government that we pay taxes to, is have some say into what our government buys. If we want our government to buy locally made products, if we want our government to buy domestically made products, if we want our government to buy environmentally friendly products, our government can pass procurement rules, specific government purchasing rules that decide what government can and can't buy. TPP explicitly prohibits these kind of rules. And for the environment, that's terrible news, because it means any kind of green purchasing rules, whether that's about recycled content, whether that's about responsible wood sourcing, whether that's about really just any manner of environmental regulation that you can think of on products the government could buy, can potentially be challenged by a foreign investor in one of the other TPP countries. So so when we think about who the countries are involved in TPP and what are some of the environmental stakes, it's very frightening. Some of these are countries that have critical endangered ecosystems, countries like Malaysia and Peru, countries that have biodiverse habitats that are under attack by a range of extractive industries, by logging, by oil, by mining, etc. One of the biggest and most talked about concerns about TPP is that it follows in the footsteps of NAFTA in including what's called investor-state dispute resolution. And what that means is that foreign corporations are granted the right to sue our government in international tribunals outside the jurisdiction of our court system, where they can demand unlimited sums in compensation for lost potential future profits. Now that's a lot of words, so what does that all mean? Well, let me give you an example of what that means. In El Salvador, there's a river called the Rio Lempa. And near the Rio Lempa, there was a mining project that a company called Pacific Rim, which is a Canadian mining company, decided they were going to conduct for gold that was potentially going to permanently contaminate this river that provides 60% of the drinking water for the entire country. There was massive outcry. The government, under public pressure, canceled this mining project, and the mining company which is a Canadian company, used a subsidiary in Nevada to claim to be a U.S. company so that they could sue for damages under the U.S. Central America Free Trade Agreement for $170 million. Now, have they invested $170 million in this mine? No, not even close. They barely invested anything in this mine. But what they were claiming was that they were entitled to compensation for all of the money they might have made, in theory, if they'd struck gold and gotten massive amounts of gold and been able to turn it around for $170 million. That's how this works. And the cases abound. There's one right now in Peru, where the Peruvian government is being sued by a U.S. investor for Peru's audacity in demanding that a company responsible for a smelter that is considered one of the 10 most toxic sites on the planet remediate that smelter. The U.S. company is demanding compensation and for the outrage of being asked to clean up the site that is poisoning communities. Case after case, the U.S. being sued by a Canadian company for prohibiting a toxic fuel additive. Canada being sued by a U.S. company for prohibiting a toxic fuel additive. Canada being sued repeatedly by U.S. pesticide manufacturers like Dow for banning toxic pesticide imports. In one case, Canada banned a pesticide that is being phased out globally for being toxic. Now, you'd think that if there's a global phase-out, you can't sue a country for phasing something out. You'd think that, except that's not apparently how corporations think NAFTA works. So this investor-state dispute resolution has a massive economic cost on countries, attacks environmental laws, leads to environmental policies being overturned, and also leads to environmental laws never being passed, because countries fear these massive suits. For a country like the US, we can fight these cases out, we can foot the bill. For a country like El Salvador, which is a small and poor country, the economic impact of having to pay out on one of these cases is devastating. And one issue that I think is near and dear to a lot of our hearts, where this investor-state dispute resolution process is being used right now, is around fracking. Right now, there is a Canadian company that, similar to the mining company, has a dummy operation in the US, incorporated in Delaware, where lots of corporations like incorporating, that is suing the Canadian government because Quebec banned fracking and claiming that that is a violation of their investor rights. So we can imagine now what's going to happen if New York bans fracking. And that's especially troubling under TPP because Japan is the #1 importer of liquid natural gas. So even under NAFTA, we may be at threat from this, but TPP makes the threat even worse. And there's something else that TPP does. We have a 1992 policy that circumvents the community approval process for the construction of liquid natural gas export terminals. Well, that is a big concern when we are about to enter a free trade agreement with the largest importer of liquid natural gas. So TPP may be the end of any hope we have of banning fracking in New York and stopping the growth of the environmentally devastating fracking industry. Free trade agreements like TPP, and especially TPP, given the geographic distance of the countries involved, are a major threat to efforts to curb climate change for one reason, because they are a total rejection of the idea of buying locally, sourcing locally, consuming local products, in part because of what I mentioned before about attacks on buy local rules, but also because they encourage greater international trade. They encourage, instead of buying products that can be made locally, they encourage the elimination of tariffs on imported goods that incentivize corporations producing overseas in markets where they can produce more cheaply with lower labor standards, lower environmental rules, and then shipping products back here. Well, that's troubling for two reasons. One, because it means corporations can circumvent our environmental laws domestically and then sell products to us cheaper than those that are bound by our environmental laws. But it also means that goods are being shipped greater distances, which means a greater environmental impact from the fossil fuels being used to ship those goods. And one of the areas where we've seen the effect of, on a very devastating level, of outsourcing and offshoring production because of the elimination of import tariffs is in agriculture. In 1994, when NAFTA was passed, Smithfield Foods, the massive factory pork company, decided to outsource offshore pork production to a massive factory farm in Veracruz, Mexico, called Carroll Ranches. Well, this is a company that had been fined for its terrible and toxic practices in the Chesapeake Bay, the company that was notorious for terrible pollution in the US. But they decided that what they could get away with in the US was not enough. So they moved to Mexico, where they set up a filthy factory farm operation, and you can see pictures of just hogs, dead hogs floating in water of the atrocious factory effluent lagoons that they created. And unsurprisingly, they made an entire community sick. Lots of people this factory farm incubated disease. Lots of people got sick with this mysterious illness that spread throughout Mexico and then came north of the border, and they called it swine flu. And pretty soon 18,000 people died. Well, the hog industry considered this a major crisis, and they needed to immediately respond to this terrible turn of events. They needed to respond to this crisis in the most important way possible, which is to make sure that we started calling the disease H1N1 and not swine flu, because it was a public relations disaster. Did they stop outsourcing production? Did they stop factory farming? Of course not. One of the other areas that now that we've transitioned into food a bit, one of the things that we need to be very concerned about, we hear these nice words like partnership and free trade that are built into these agreements that are really hide very sinister things. Another word that we should watch out for is harmonization. Beautiful word, harmonization. I was giving this talk in Washington Square Park the other day, and there was a group of a cappella singers harmonizing as I was talking about this, which just perfectly illustrated the point. I mean, what could be wrong with harmonization? Well, here's another term for harmonization, which is race to the bottom. What this really means is creating a flat line of standards across the board for the benefit of corporations, so that if any country has higher food safety standards, we basically play whack-a-mole and knock them down to our lower standards. So, for example, 160 countries have banned a livestock drug called ractopamine. And ractopamine was originally developed as an asthma medication, failed at that, was repurposed as a drug to make livestock leaner. And they found out that it makes livestock very sick, causes lots of animal suffering, makes people who eat the meat of these animals pretty sick. So a lot of countries very sensibly banned it. The US is not one of those countries. So instead of seeing TPP as an opportunity to raise our standards, since President Obama calls this a high standards trade agreement, we did just the opposite. We knocked down everyone else. We're trying to knock down everyone else's standards. Even the countries that are not in this agreement yet, like Taiwan, are having their arms twisted to lift their ractopamine ban in preparation for maybe being considered for TPP. Japan had their arms twisted to lift their regulations on beef from animals over 30 months of age out of concern about mad cow disease. On the flip side, we are going to be under TPP importing a lot more toxic food. We're going to be importing Vietnamese shrimp that is toxic with pesticides, but not increasing our inspection capacity to actually pick out dangerous food. We're going to be importing trans-shipped Chinese shrimp via Malaysia, meaning shrimp that Malaysia imports from China and then reships to us. One final area to be concerned about, and particularly going into the future, I mentioned before how the extractive industries benefit greatly from these trade agreements. The oil, the gas, the mining industries, the logging industry, often at the expense of indigenous communities who fight battles to the death to defend their land, as in Peru, where a community was massacred for rising up against a land grab facilitated by the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement. Well, another area that we have to be very concerned about with TPP is palm oil. Malaysia is very concerned about TPP. They're talking about carefully studying this agreement before ever entering into it. Well, to sweeten the pot, one of the things that's being talked about with TPP in future negotiations is increasing removing barriers to palm oil exports. And palm oil is absolutely environmentally devastating. We are wiping out rainforests around the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia, for the supposedly environmentally friendly biofuel that is actually more environmentally destructive than petroleum. In Southeast Asia, we are wiping out the habitat for orangutans, for pygmy elephants who are being poisoned for eating the palm fruit, for Malayan tigers, in order to create these plantations and wipe out some of the most pristine and critical and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. So when we hear about TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we should really think about it as the polluter's power grab. That's what TPP really is. That's one of the reasons we need to stop it. And I'm going to now turn over to some of our other speakers so you can hear about some of the other terrible things about TPP.
I'm going to be talking about free trade agreements a lot and what I have to say. So if I say FTA, you'll understand that that's free trade agreement, not fun, travel, and adventure. Jennifer was talking about the TPP as being the biggest FTA. It covers, at this point, 40% of the world's economy. That's how big it is. Okay, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the latest in this series of free trade agreements that have come into existence since the late 1980s. The first of these, the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in 1988, was quickly followed by NAFTA in 1991, and now there are over. Somebody tell me if I'm talking too loudly, because I have no idea.
That's good.
Okay, somebody tell me. Okay. Quickly followed by NAFTA in 1991. And now there are more than a dozen multilateral free trade agreements and over 3,000 bilateral FTAs and investment treaties. So we have a lot of historical experience to draw on in terms of analyzing this document that we've only seen a few pieces of that have been leaked. It's important to understand that most of these agreements, as Adam was saying, have very little to do with trade, but they have everything to do with economic and political dominance. A quick history lesson. At the end of World War II, the United States and a group of other rich nations created three important international institutions: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, commonly called GATT. The purpose of these institutions was to manage the world's economy, which they have done ever since the end of World War II, and they've operated very much to the advantage of the rich countries. The IMF and the World Bank lend money, capital, to poor countries, supposedly to help them develop, i.e. industrialize. If these countries can't pay the money back, as often happens, the IMF and World Bank may impose certain conditions or structural adjustments. For example, the debtor nation will be forced to slash public services, privatize major national industries, and allow foreign corporations to exploit its natural resources. Think of what's going on in Greece right now. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was the third institution created then. In 1995, the GATT was restructured as the World Trade Organization, and it took its place alongside the IMF and the World Bank as the manager and arbiter of global financial power by facilitating a series of free trade agreements. Here, I'd like to introduce a word that is in common use in the international sphere, but not frequently heard within the United States. That word is neoliberalism. It has nothing to do with liberalism, the social and political liberalism that we're familiar with. It is not at all about liberating people, it's about liberating financial capital. Under neoliberalism, profit becomes the arbiter of all questions, whether they're questions about finance and trade or human rights and the environment. Neoliberalism aspires to, and does, deregulate industry, privatize schools, hospitals, utilities, public transportation, and anything else that's run in the people's interest. Shreds the social safety net, smashing organized labor. In international relations, one of the main ways neoliberalism manifests itself is in free trade agreements. That's what we're seeing now with the TPP. Neoliberalism has been embraced by every US president from Reagan on, and it's now the dominant economic philosophy in the world. TPP did not come out of nowhere. Free trade agreements make it easier for companies to move their operations to countries with cheaper labor. And then this flight of jobs overseas puts downward pressure on the wages and conditions of the jobs that remain in the home country. NAFTA resulted in the loss of at least 700,000 jobs in the US.